Hello. Today we're going to talk about the story of resiliency. And so, hi, welcome. I'm Amanda Jane. I am a consultant for entrepreneurs and organizations who are trying to integrate and incorporate more joy and creativity into their change making initiatives. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I also have my master's in public health, and I am a Jill of all trades, all around whatever person, multi passionate, multi talented. Oh, this is weird. All right, there we go. So let's get into it. Welcome. We're talking a little bit about burnout recovery, or we're definitely talking about burnout recovery this week. And I want to spend some time to talk about this idea of resiliency. And so, last week we talked about the story of executive leadership, or what it means to be, a high performing CEO. And now I really want to touch on and break down this story or concept of resiliency a little bit more. And really what it is, so there's this idea of resiliency, or the sort of common definition of being able to bounce back, right? Being like a rubber band, being able to bounce back from something. And in modern US culture, which is hyper Western and hyper individualistic, right? There's this idea of resiliency as something that is unique to an individual. And I want to challenge this a little bit, right? And so there are plenty of people who have already brought challenge to this, and so I want to sort of bring that conversation forward a little bit. So first and foremost, I don't know how many times you've tried to stretch or shoot a rubber band, but after so many times of doing that, it becomes overstretched and it eventually does break or wear down, right? And so I think the rubber band bounce back analogy for resiliency is not the most constructive or the most accurate. And it's also not unique to an individual. And so I think my favorite definition of resiliency so far comes from Resmo Menachem in his book, My Grandmother's Hands. I think that even just reading that section or that chapter, even if you don't read the whole book, but frankly, read the whole book. He does a really beautiful job of breaking down this concept of resiliency, not as a state of being or a particular personality trait, but more as a flow to be embodied, a sort of something that comes from nature and nurture, right? From our own initiative as well as the community around us. And so it really is about sort of how we move through adversity and being in our ability to be able to move and flow through adversity. And one of the things that I want to touch on here is you can be an extremely resilient person, and if you are in an environment that is extremely rigid, or where no matter how many times you try to bend and sway and flow, you're constantly being pulled or pushed or crowded or whatever, you can't actually move, then it doesn't matter how resilient you are. So if the environment you're in is not resilient in any way, not flexible in any way, then it doesn't matter how resilient you are. If it's an unhealthy, adverse environment, your resiliency is not going to protect you. It's not going to save you, right? It's not going to be enough. And so, this is Context Matters with Amanda Jane, right? So your environment matters, and we have this really hyper individualized approach to self-care and resiliency and mental health that is actually not functional or effective. And again, like, this is not, I'm not sharing anything that hasn't been said before by many different people, many different types of people, particularly people who've already been dealing with adversity for in their real lives, right, day to day, for a long time. So, there is a lot of truth that needs to be heard in that understanding and in that experience of individual resiliency is not enough. Now, the converse of that is, even if you yourself struggle to adapt or flow, as we're talking about flow with adversity, so adapt, shift, alter your pace, alter your expectations, and sort of manage whatever challenges you're faced with. If you struggle with that individually, but you are in a community or in a setting, in an environment that is highly skilled at adapting and changing, then you are going to have a much better outcome or experience with your adversity, right? So with navigating those challenges, because you have this whole support system around you, you have all of these different environmental factors, whether that's other individuals, a sense of community, the structure, these different components of your environment, of your context. When that is resilient, then even if change is scary or you struggle with, navigating a challenge or having to adjust when you weren't planning to or hoping to or wanting to, it becomes so much easier than the first scenario where you're extremely good at adapting, but you're in an environment that is too rigid and lacks resiliency. So this is part of also of why, one, it's really important as a leader and a manager to be extremely mindful of the culture that you are building and how that actually creates resiliency, not by putting it on each individual person, but by actually creating a dynamic and a management structure or an operational structure that is flexible, that is resilient, can adapt to different needs and different challenges that arise. If that is not flexible in any way, there needs to be, I think of it, one of the things that comes from my mental health background, specifically around people who are, in recovery, right? And recovering from trauma and substance use disorders and things like that, different types of dependencies. There's a concept of scaffolding, and I'm going to forget which psychologist brought this up, but this idea of when you're a provider, you're not trying to create structure and you're not trying to be the person that somebody leans on, because eventually you're going to need to go step away. And if they're leaning on you, they're going to fall over as soon as you step away, right? So what you want is to be more like scaffolding, where you help keep the foundation in place, or you help sort of hold the structure or the sort of general framework as someone is building their foundation and building themselves up. And eventually you take that scaffolding away and they're able to stand on their own. They're able to support themselves, right? Or the same thing if you're like, I love garden analogies. And so if you think about, sometimes when you plant certain trees or certain types of plants, or even like tomato plants, right? You see that they have those like little cages or the trellises, and that's to give them something to help them grow, because they're too top heavy, or like they have all of this foliage, but their trunk, their base isn't strong enough yet to support all of this foliage or all of the fruit or all of whatever it is that they're producing. And so until they get to a point where they are well established and they have a strong root system, then you can take that support away, and you have this thriving tree, right? This thriving plant. So that is the same concept you can apply to management. So I want us to get rid of this story, or to, maybe not get rid of, but at least challenge this story that the only way that everything is dependent on the individual, right? So I really want us to think about the interconnection and the interconnectivity between an individual's responsibility and what we as individuals have control over, right? So there is a certain level of power that we do have when we acknowledge that we have choices that we can make, and we use our agency to make those choices. Sometimes they're difficult choices. Sometimes they're things that you don't necessarily want to have to do, but they are choices that are available to you. And only you can control how you respond or react to any given situation. And from a management perspective, from a community perspective, from an organizational perspective, if you are not trying to create an adverse environment for your employees, if that's how you want to operate, I don't understand it. Like, that's not my thing. That's not where I would want to work. But, power to you, whatever. Have fun with that. But if you are trying to cultivate and create an environment where people are actually excited to show up and perform and do their job, and everybody make your company lots of money because there's something satisfying or healthy, there's something that feels good about whatever it is that they're doing, then you have to think about the environment that you're creating. And you can't control what each individual person does. So it's not a matter of you just need to be more resilient, or you just need to practice more mindfulness. There are elements of that might be true, but there's a scaffolding that you need to create. There's a certain framework and accountability structure that needs to be in place, that it allows your organization to adapt and be flexible, for your organization to be resilient. And that will then foster resiliency on your teams. And when you have highly resilient individuals in a highly resilient environment, then the world's your oyster as far as I'm concerned, because you are going to have the ability to accomplish a lot and to pivot and shift however you need to. Now, in bigger companies where there's a certain element of structure or consistency that is required, or takes more time to change or shift, that's understandable. And again, there's opportunities there. And so that's something to explore. That's something that I help my clients explore. But when you're thinking about resiliency, there's the U.S. Surgeon General came out with a framework for workplace mental health and well-being that addresses the 10 core needs of any individual, especially a working individual, and they categorize it into 5 different areas. And so that is one place. I'm gonna let me see if I can pull this up really quick so I can remember what all of those are really quick. But right, okay, so the 5 different areas are protection from harm. So that's really focusing on the safety and security of each need of each person. There's connection and community, which speaks to the core needs of social support and belonging. Work-life harmony, and I really like this harmony term. I'm going to talk more about that when I talk about how to unfuck your work-life balance. And that speaks to autonomy and flexibility. This is also part of resiliency, a huge part of resiliency. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Mattering at work, so that sense of dignity and meaning. And I spoke a little bit about meaning earlier this week. So all of these things, you can see the other thing is opportunity for growth. So like having that, like learning and accomplishment. So I just want to capture that, but you can see how some of the things that I touched on earlier this week in terms of the 3 ways that burnout affects us in terms of having really harmful or at least like existential crisis like impacts on our sense of self, sense of meaning, and sense of purpose. So when you're thinking about resiliency, part of this story of resiliency is really learning how to stay grounded in your sense of self as an individual and as an organization. You need to know who you are as a company. You need to know who you are as an organization to stay grounded in that identity. And it doesn't mean that you can't grow and shift, just like we as individuals, we're always going to grow and evolve. And so, but there's this core sense of self, this core identity that we always carry with us. And we need to make sure that we're really clear on what that is and who that is. So that as we grow, we can grow with intention, right? We can grow in a way that feels nourishing and supportive and supported, rather than growing in a way where we feel really like uncomfortable or like just not supported. Like we're sort of that the difference between having the scaffolding to keep the tree steady as it builds its root system, and taking that away versus not having that and having to struggle with that. So either way, you're going to grow, either way, you're going to evolve. It's just a matter of, are you going to be thriving or are you just going to be surviving? And again, with that sense of meaning, with resiliency, when you know where you fit in, where you belong, or just where you are, even if you don't belong there, like having that understanding of this is the environment. I can see, I have my flashlight, right? I have my like little lantern, and so I can sort of and I see the sky, I can navigate by the stars, whatever metaphor works for you. You can see how it all fits together, or what the big picture is. And so that is also part of resiliency. Like our part of that flow, part of that nature and nurture is being able to keep things in perspective, right? When we are faced with what might seem like an insurmountable challenge, or when we have an immediate reaction to a challenge that feels like, and we're sort of like, oh my God, like this is just the last thing I need and whatever, like I'm so stressed, I'm so overwhelmed, I can't believe that like now I have to deal with all of this bullshit, whatever, blah, 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 like complain, vent, let it, like, release it, let it go, whatever you need to do. But then you need to find your way back to what matters, right? And so when we're in burnout, we've lost all, like we're like, our world is topsy-turvy, everything feels really dark or too bright or whatever it is. We can't find that perspective. It's really hard to find that perspective in the environment. For a lot of people who are in really toxic environments, especially if you're not in a position of power or authority to change that environment, my advice is to leave like as soon as you can. Save up money, make an exit strategy, and leave. Because you cannot recover from burnout in an environment that is constantly reinforcing this inability to hold perspective or to put things in perspective in a healthy way, in a way that helps you align and then figure out what your next step is, right? What your purpose is, or how you fit in, or how you can get and start working towards something like recovery, something healthy and more sustainable and more manageable, right? So you need to keep that perspective as an organization, and for you as an individual. If your organization isn't doing that, if the environment you're in isn't able to offer that perspective, or be consistent in its perspective, right? It's sort of like one day it's this, one day it's that, and nobody seems to know. And they're not, it's just everybody's a chicken little running around trying to scream that a different part of the sky is falling every single day. Then pause, press pause, leave that environment, take a break, use your PTO. I don't care, whatever it is, and get some perspective. Step out of that environment and reorient. Reorient yourself and get that perspective, because that will then help you figure out what's next and how you can flow. That is where the resiliency comes in. Because if you don't have that perspective, then you're never, like, it doesn't matter how much you adapt, because there's always going to be something else that feels like it's urgent or that it's on fire, and you won't be able to prioritize. And so, and with that sense of purpose, right, that sense, your values, and sort of how are your actions aligning with your values, your core identity, the sense of meaning and what matters and the perspective that you have. That's why I always put that last, because you having some of that environment, or knowing what your landscape is, and having that clarity of like what you say you want, helps you make sure that your actions are aligned with that, right? And so the same thing as an organization. If you are telling people that you value self-care, but you are always pressuring people to cover for everybody who's taking vacation, or you're constantly stressed about not having enough coverage, or whatever it is, like if you're advocating for something but then creating a space, or you're taking up too much of people's time so they can't actually get their jobs done because they're constantly meeting with you, or you're constantly asking for all of these changes to the point where you're not actually accomplishing or meeting your deadlines because you're micromanaging, or whatever the case might be. You're either too hands-on, too hands-off, or you're being too hypocritical, to be frank with it. Then people are not going to believe you when they say, or they're going to roll their eyes when you talk about self-care, because you clearly don't actually value it, because you're not actually enforcing it. You're just saying it because you know it's something that needs to be said, or you know it's something that it should be important, but you're not actually creating the scaffolding, the structure, the environment to support it. So in this story of resiliency, right, we've unpacked, let's get rid of this idea that it is only an individual thing, or that an organization's resiliency is solely dependent on the resiliency of an individual, of the leader, of the individuals on the team. It is a both and situation. Individuals need to learn how to adapt and change and evolve in the face of challenges, obstacles, and adversity, but they cannot do it alone. And if they are constantly doing it in an environment that does not support them, they're still going to burn out. They're going to get exhausted. Anybody who's resilient still needs care and support. Any individual person, like, I don't care. Like, yeah, we all need care and support, right? So people get tired of being strong. People get tired of having to constantly adapt and change and roll with the punches, right? We all deserve time to rest and just be in that place where everything is actually going mostly right, you know? But that requires a supportive environment. That requires other people on their team, in their environment, in their community, in their space, in their organization, who can show up and provide that support, right? Provide that scaffolding. And so you need to, if you want to have a resilient organization and a resilient workforce, you need to structure yourselves accordingly. So it's not just an individual's responsibility, it is also a structural and systemic responsibility. And if you are the CEO, in the C-suite, the sort of the people who are making the decisions on how the organization is structured to achieve its goals, and to drive revenue or whatever it is. This is, you can't leave this off the table and just put it on everybody else, or just hope that everybody else has their shit together and figure it out, or hope that you're hiring all the right people who have all the right skills in all of these areas, because you're not. You're going to have people who are skilled in the priority areas that you need them to be skilled in, but they're not going to be able to be super person, right? They're not going to be able to have it all right off the bat. It is very rare to find someone who has everything in one package, ready to go right from the gate. We all have skill deficits or skills that require more practice or more support to develop. And so you need to figure out ways that you're going to support people in developing those skills. You might also hire people who are extremely resilient or have all of these really amazing soft skills, but still need a lot of technical training to actually drive your revenue, to perform at the level that you need them to be productive, or to work towards the mission, or to sort of be efficient in whatever it is that they're doing. So again, you really just, it's a both and. You need to think about all of this together. So that is the story of resiliency. It is a both and story. It is not one versus many, or many versus one. It is everybody. Everybody has a role to play. The system and the structures need to support the individuals, because as I mentioned, individuals who are highly resilient but are in a toxic, unresilient, inflexible environment will not last very long. They're not going to be able to sustain that. It's just not, if they do, you're gonna see, whether it's within a year or several years, chronic health conditions, or they're gonna be taking more leave. They might actually develop a substance dependency, right? They might self-medicate with different things, or they're going to stop caring so much about the organization and the work that it does. And so they're not going to be performing at the same level that they could be and maybe have in the past. So like they're just going to burn out, they're going to fade, and they might do what they got to do to survive and to keep their head in their, keep their position. But it's going to negatively affect them in the long run. Which means that you're going to lose them. And so if you have an environment that is able to be more flexible and to provide more support, then the people who are already extremely resilient are going to thrive, and they're going to help those who might struggle with resiliency build that skill. Because again, it is not just a state of being. It's not something that you're born with. It is learning how to flow with the challenges life throws at you. That's what resiliency is. So Resma Menachem, go read his book, look him up. He has a lot of really great ways of framing really challenging and difficult concepts and experiences. He's a somatic therapist. For those of you who are interested in that kind of thing. And in general, just think about what an adaptable, flexible environment can look like in your agency and what steps you might need to take to get there. So on Friday, I'm going to talk a little bit. I'm going to provide a couple of skills. This is probably going to be more focused towards individuals. But I try to make it adaptable for all. So I'm going to give you 3 questions and 3 potential boundaries to help you in your burnout recovery process, to really figure out what you want your recovery to look like, or what you might need in order to actually get through burnout and get back to a place where you feel like your full self, you feel energized, you feel good, and you feel motivated and inspired to do whatever it is to work to live, right? or to live to work if that is something that inspires you. I'm a work to live person, but you know, to each their own. So anyway, thank you. That's all I have for you today, and I will catch you on the flip side.